In the December 1st, 2025 edition of the Wall Street Journal, there was this headline on page R25. These 10 books changed the way Americans thought about work. Carol Hymowitz, the author, wrote, "It began with Benjamin Franklin, who couldn't stop working or writing about work throughout his 84-year-long life." Carol Hymowitz has been associated with the Wall Street Journal since she got her master's degree in journalism at Columbia University. Other books she featured in this article about work include Tocqueville, Frederick Douglass, Upton Sinclair, John Steinbeck, Dale Carnegie, and C. Wright Mills, plus others. We wanted to know how she chose these 10 books about work, and so we had a chat. Carol Hymowitz, when did you first get interested in the written word?
Oh, really, as a little girl, I loved reading and loved going to the library. Uh, One of my favorite things as a kid was there were a lot of biographies about famous people when they were children, and I read all of them.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in New York City.
How did you get involved at the Wall Street Journal?
I was very lucky. I applied there after journalism school, and I got hired in Pittsburgh bureau. At that point, most people were being hired in bureaus rather than into the New York bureau, which was the headquarters. But it was a great experience.
When you went about selecting 10 books, how did you do it?
I started really researching what had been written about work over time. I talked to a couple of historians, both American history professors, but also business historians. Initially, I was doing it pretty broadly. Ultimately, we decided to focus on work rather than management, and that narrowed it a bit. Um, and it was really from talking to historians, looking at a lot of documents, using a bit of AI help, and narrowing it down.
Before you got to 10,
Hmm.
how many were on your list?
Oh, at least 50. And the 10 I want to stress weren't necessarily the best books, but they had enormous influence and sold very well. So they were widely read.
How many of them had you read before you picked the 10?
Mm. I would say probably 20 maybe, and not completely. Sometimes I'd scan books. I had read de Tocqueville uh, partly when I was doing some other research. I had never read Ben Franklin. I had heard his proverbs all my life, but I'd never read him.
On your list, as you well know, it starts out in 1791, I believe, and goes
Right.
all the way to the last book is 2001.
Hmm.
Ben Franklin was number one. What did you know about him before you got involved in all this?
I knew he was an inventor. I knew he had run a printing business and he had this calendar that was very popular called Poor Richard's Almanac that had a lot of proverbs in them. He published the calendar once a year. Um, I didn't know much about his autobiography, and I certainly didn't know how widespread the proverbs were read.
What did you what did you take away from his autobiography?
How complicated and rich his life had been. He was definitely a self-made man. He left his family at 12 because he didn't get along with his brother, who he was apprenticed to, and he moved to a different city, became hugely successful there. He also was the original reinventor of his career. So I found that interesting. He started out, of course, as a printing apprentice, ran his own business, but then he became an inventor and a diplomat and one of the founders of the country.
Why do you think it sold so many copies back in his day?
He was pretty well known. I mean, one thing I want to mention is that his book called The Way to Wealth, which somehow didn't get mentioned in this, which was a compilation of all his proverbs from Sir Richard's Poor Richard's Almanac, came out in 1757. And that was widely read. I mean, it was widely read throughout the US and in Europe. The autobiography wasn't as widely read because it had been written over a long period of time and didn't become published until after his death, but it pulled everything together. Um,
You have
and
a, go ahead.
it appeared after the revolution. I was being asked write about books from 1775, and so Poor Richard's was previous to that, and The Way to Wealth was previous, but I mentioned them in writing about it.
You do have one quote I want to ask you about because I doubt if anybody listening to this hasn't heard this. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Had you heard that before? And what do you think of the quote?
Yes, I heard it as a child. I think every child in America heard it. Um, I think it makes sense, but it's not necessarily the only way to wealth.
In your own family, how much was work? How important was it?
It was important, actually, very important to my mother at a time when not that many women worked full time, but she ultimately became an elementary school teacher and she really loved it. She talked about it a lot at home. So
Did you have siblings?
I did. I have two sisters.
And what did they do in work besides you were a writer?
I was a writer. Um, One of my sisters became a teacher of very young children, so she followed my mother's tradition. And my other sister became a social worker.
The second one on your list you mentioned just a few minutes ago, uh, Tocqueville and his book Democracy in America. This network did a whole series on Tocqueville. We went to 55 different cities and did special shows.
Wow.
And you picked it as number two. It was in 1835 to 1840. There are two different versions of it. And when did you first get introduced to democracy in America?
I actually got into it in my 20s when I was doing some research on American history over time and women's place in it. Um, and read part of de Tocqueville then. I found it very interesting for this article because he didn't come to really observe about work. He was really looking at institutions and how democracy worked, as you must know. Um, but he really observed how a couple of things about work in America. The fact that manual labor wasn't valued the way it was in Europe, where only lower class people did manual work. Here, you could do manual work and have status and earn wealth. Um, and also how you could keep changing your career. And he talked about the restless nature of Americans, keep finding new things to do, move westward, have more opportunities.
Did you reflect at all on the fact that this guy was only about 25, 26 years old when he came over here for nine
Yeah,
months?
pretty amazing.
Where were you first introduced to it? In school?
No, when I was doing research, I wasn't introduced to de Tocqueville in school because I wasn't a history major. I probably would have been if I had been a history major.
What was your major? You went to Brandeis?
Right. And I was a literature major.
What about your journalism degree? Where did you get that?
Columbia.
What'd you learn getting a master's degree about writing in journalism?
Well, I learned writing's very hard and it can be lonely, but you really have to spend time thinking about the material you've gathered or invented, and then kind of let go of everything you've learned and just try to write the story, find the germ of the story.
When Democracy in America was published, there were only 13 million people in the United States.
Mhm.
And I went through all of your 10 books, checking the populations. Do you think it had anything to do with what these folks were writing, the number of people in the country at the time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And who was writing and who was educated enough to write?
Did you have a favorite one of these books?
Mhm. Really hard. Um, I was struck by Frederick Douglass's book. I hadn't read the entire book before I included it on this list. I was looking for something related to slavery and that had captured the attention of a lot of Americans, because slavery was such an economic system and so important to the development of this country in terms of the labor that what it produced. But it was so graphically written and so descriptive, and that really moved me. I was struck by The Jungle because I'm a journalist, and it was an undertaking by another journalist, although he wrote it as a novel. He went underground, and oh, just a lot of them.
Well, on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, I dipped into it a bit in preparation for our talk.
Mhm.
Um, the story that really knocked me over was the fact that he never saw his mother in the daylight,
Exactly.
and and and
Ever.
and she walked miles to see him at night while she was working every day in the fields.
Exactly. Which shows how family structure among enslaved people was so strong, even though it was not, it was really being destroyed constantly. I
How
was
much
also struck with Douglass had basically a good slavery. I mean, he wasn't at a huge plantation, and he ultimately was with somebody who taught him to read a little bit before her husband said, "Don't do that anymore." But yet it was so brutal.
did you have any sense of what impact his book had on the public when he was alive?
I didn't realize how it was so read. And of course, there was the controversy. He was accused of not writing it. He faced the accusation that he could never have written this.
Did they ever prove that he did write it or didn't write it?
They did prove it, but he went through a lot with that.
The next one you mentioned was The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, who actually was very political.
Very political, which I hadn't known. I'd heard of the book before, of course, and it had been mentioned in history courses I'd taken. But I didn't realize he was a socialist and worked for a socialist newspaper. But it was the idea of doing this that was so fascinating to me that he decided to go into a meat factory and work in it and go undercover, really, and capture what went on there.
There were 76 million people in the United States when he did his book. Um, it was 1904. What impact did the book have on the public?
That book had a huge impact. It alarmed the public. They were terrified. They were eating tainted meat, meat filled with disease, and actually parts of human bodies of the workers that ended up ground up. And it was more the alarm about the safety of the meat than the devastating conditions of the workers that captured the imagination or the alarm of the public. President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt got involved in it, and they sent inspectors, and of course it led to the uh, safety laws,
We'll be right back.
The
really
1906,
legislating how meat was manufactured.
the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act.
Pure Food and Drug Act, which then led to federal, the Food and Drug Administration.
Is it my memory that he went on to run for governor of California?
I think he did. Yeah, he did a lot of different things. He had a complicated life.
What were your, I don't know if you call them instructions, but when your editor said they wanted this article for the Wall Street Journal, how much did they tell you they wanted?
Not much, just that it had to be only 10 books. They didn't have room for more. And they wanted books that represented different eras. For instance, there were a lot of books about the workplace written in the early 1900s, in the genre of the jungle, of other industries, over a couple of decades there. The Octopus was written by Frank Norris about farm workers. There was later on a book about the steel workers called Out of the Furnace. But I couldn't, I had to move along and so I could represent different periods.
How long did it take you to put this article together?
About a month.
Did you have to work on it every day?
I got pretty involved in it. I really enjoyed doing it because I realized I was learning American history while I was doing it.
And where do you live full time?
I live in New York City.
And what is your connection, if there still is one, to Stanford?
Well, I worked as a research fellow at Stanford for a few years. I'm still connected, but not formally. And they do a great deal of research on longevity.
After you were in Pittsburgh, where did you go?
I went to New York for the Wall Street Journal, was there for quite a long time. Ultimately, then I went to Forbes very briefly, but then Bloomberg.
When do you enjoy work the most?
When I'm doing something, an article that really gets me to learn something new that I don't know about, and or meeting people that are very intriguing to me.
Is there any way to describe the amount of learning you got from doing this article?
A huge amount of learning from doing this piece. I'm still doing research. I'm trying to find more books on work. And there were so many that got left out, and so many I'm sure I don't know about because of the nature of work in the United States, the degree to which one can, not always, but for many people, you can keep changing what you do, you can keep advancing. It wasn't as rigidly structured as in Europe. Um, a lot of people left records and they wrote their diaries. They weren't writers, but they left a lot of information.
Where do you find that?
That's hard. And I think you have to go through historians and university libraries, sometimes through industries. For instance, the first factory workers in the US were women who worked in the textile mills in the early 1800s. They did a newspaper, and those newspapers still exist, and they talked about what their lives were like in the textile mills.
Do you have any sense, just from your observations, what the toughest job there is?
Uh, Probably coal mining underground before it was mechanized. Terrible.
Where would you put writing on that list?
Oh, definitely a job of advantage. It's certainly, I mean, it can be a hard job, but it's usually a job one chooses rather than one feels forced to do because you're not educated for something else.
On
One,
your list, go ahead.
I'm sorry, one big omission in this list is farming, which I feel very badly about. It was such an important job for Americans for so long, and there were some great books written, but I never could find exactly the right one, and I feel that's lacking in the article.
Uh, I have a question on the mechanics of all this. Did you have to get each of these books approved by the journal?
No,
They
no, I
just
didn't have
they
to get
just
any of them approved by the journal.
did they just take it as you submitted it?
Well, I actually ended up, yeah, they took it as I did it. I had two extra books on it, but they decided they couldn't do 12. Um,
What were they?
what were they? They were, uh, one was a book about robotics. I'm forgetting the machine age, I believe it's called. That's another thing that's lacking here. We're now moving into an entirely new period in the workplace of automation, AI. I felt like we needed to mention that. The book, nothing's, not one book has yet had the kind of impact that some of the others on the list have had, or the ones that I found. And I also had Studs Terkel's Working, a book I really like, where he interviewed workers, all kinds of workers, and had them talk in their own words about what their work was like.
And Suds Terkel recorded all those, and I don't know whether is that in the Columbia Library?
Yeah,
Or
I think so. Yeah.
yeah, because I mean he did a book that the book is actually called Working, is in my memory.
Hmm.
And
It is called Working. That's his
yeah,
book, Working.
did you get a chance to read any of it?
Yes, I did. And I had read it when it first came out in the 1970s, early 1970s, I believe. But I started rereading it again.
On your list, number five, this is a person I personally had never heard of. Principles of Scientific Management by Frederick Taylor. Who was he?
He was a manager in a factory. And the reason I heard about this book was through a business professor at Yale who said he was hugely important in shaping how work was done in factories and starting in the US, and started to read about him. And he created his principles around the same time Henry Ford did his his automated the factories in Detroit, the Ford factories. Taylor really changed how work is done. Before he wrote this book, in the factories, work was done as a craft. Everyone did their own, the way they did it. And they would teach the next person, this is how I do it. He decided we need to make this more efficient. And he started studying each task and timing it, and then would create the standard way to do it. It standardized work. And that was a huge change. It ultimately became used not just in factories, but offices.
This was 1911.
Right.
And I wrote down this quote from President Theodore Roosevelt. It's related to Frederick Taylor wrote. I believe this was in May of 1908. He said, "The conservation of our national resources is only preliminary to the large question of national efficiency."
Hmm.
Have we gotten more efficient or less efficient since the early 1900s?
That is very interesting question. I don't think I'm the right person to answer it, but I probably think we've gotten more efficient, though. I mean, computers have made things a lot more efficient.
What has been your reaction to switching from either a typewriter to a computer or even to AI?
It's always it was a huge adjustment for me to switch from a typewriter to a computer. I'm old enough to have started work on a typewriter, but once I did, I loved it. So much easier. You can edit easily, you can rewrite easily. Now I can't imagine going back to a typewriter.
You,
AI, I'm just getting a little familiar with.
how are you using AI?
For some research, but I double check everything because I've found it's not always accurate, often not accurate.
You might be interested. I did a little my own statistics that among the 10 authors, The youngest died at age 45, who was C. Wright Mills, who we'll talk about in a moment. And the oldest was 90, and that was Upton Sinclair.
Hmm.
And we're at book number 6. And I have to tell you, this book, I've never read the book. I mean, I read some of it because of this article, which was fun, but I've only had one person in my life, and he read this 50 some years ago. And actually, I tried to get a hold of him to talk to him about it, and that is How to Win Friends and Influence People, which in his case, he's a real estate broker, and he used it all of his life, and that's Dale Carnegie. Tell us
Uh-huh.
about that book.
Well, I hadn't really read this book either, but it was cited to me by so many people I was talking to, primarily because how widespread it's been read. What, 30 million copies? It's the most popular self-help book ever written, I believe. And the timing of it was very crucial. It came out during the Depression. People who had their jobs were scared of losing them. Of course, so many people didn't have jobs. And he really changed the thinking that the most important thing about that you needed to exhibit on a job was technical knowledge, know-how, to emotional intelligence. It's really how you relate to people that's going to help you advance. And he hit on something that was going to be so important as the country increasingly became a white collar rather than a blue collar workforce. I think it was a very accessible book, and I think that's why it had so much influence.
What did you think of the writing?
It was clear, but it wasn't literary or wasn't the kind of writing you get in The Jungle, which was so descriptive, or Frederick
He
Douglass.
he had a Dale Carnegie course that was taught, and the quote I have and is about 450,000 people graduated from that Dale Carnegie course.
Right. Well,
It's
it shows you that people were so desperate, really, for advice on how to get along and what they needed to do to keep their jobs and keep advancing. And I think the popularity of the book says as much about the workforce as it says about Dale Carnegie.
You can walk into any bookstore today. There's a copy there to buy.
Usually, certainly online.
Yeah, a lot of these early books that you write about are online. The text is online. It's free. People
They
are that
are.
interested. When Dale Carnegie wrote his book in 1936, there were 128 million people here in the United States. Today, by the way, there's 350 million, so people can, judge these numbers against what today is. Then you get to number 7, one of the most controversial people on the entire list,
Hmm.
John Steinbeck and the Grapes of Wrath. Why that book?
Again, because of the impact. I debated this a long time in my own mind, and it's actually the one book I talked to my editor about. Should this one be the one? There were other books that were really depicting, as I spoke about before, the difficulties of the workplace for workers in that time. But Grapes of Wrath had such an enormous impact. It partly because it was made into a movie starring Henry Fonda that so many people saw, and partly because of the timing. It was the height of the Depression. But those were the reasons. There was a lot of controversy about this book. One of the issues is there's a lot of thought that he borrowed notes, or he used notes that had been written by a field worker in the migrant farms, who later sued him and said she felt like he had stolen her material. She wrote her own book, which never was that successful. Um, but again, it changed thinking about the migrant workforce and unionization and what was going on at the time.
When we did our program on John Steinbeck, we went to Salinas, where he was from, where they have a Steinbeck Institute.
Hmm.
And for me, my biggest memory of John Steinbeck, besides Grapes of Wrath, is Travels with Charlie.
Yes, which is
And
probably a better book. And the other great book he wrote was Of Mice and Men, another really wonderful book. He was an excellent writer.
We'll be right back.
he also had an alcohol problem.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, I don't know where my list is here, but what the exact year that how old he was when he died. Um, he died at age 66.
Yeah.
I don't probably shouldn't mention this, but sadly the biggest memory I have from doing that program some 25 years ago is that our primary guest after that program, and I won't mention his name, committed suicide.
Oh,
It was
wow.
the strangest experience. But his son Tom was there when we did the show, and of course the car that he drove around with Charlie is also at that institute. If anybody's interested in following
Very
up
interesting.
on the West Coast, number 8 on your list, and this is interesting to me because in the last couple of years as I've been doing this podcast and reading books, this name keeps popping up time and time again. I personally had never heard the name. You have, I'm sure. C. Wright Mills.
Hmm.
He died at age 45, and you've focused on a book called White Collar. Why?
That book had, again, enormous impact, primarily in academic circles, but also the business world, because what he did was really look at the white collar force, which was growing and growing at that time. It had was becoming the dominant workforce in America. And he questioned um, the belief that white collar work was a lot easier than blue collar work. It certainly was less physically arduous, but he delved into it and really analyzed how some of the other issues that were the conformity demanded in white collar work and the routine and the boredom of a lot of people and the fact that very few people felt recognized. It was another assembly line. Um, it's a hard book to get through, I think. It's not a narrative book, it's an academic book.
It's also available online. Text is available free.
Mhm.
Um, when C. Wright Mills in 1951 wrote the book, there were 154 million people in the United States. Do you
Mhm.
have any idea why so many intellectuals today quote him?
Well, I think he was a little ahead of his time in terms of recognizing some of the problems in the work, the conformity, the routinization, the lack of uh, recognition that many workers feel, and the hierarchies, and whether that's a good thing or not.
I know in your piece you say Mills is sociologist, uh,
Yes,
challenged this belief, describing how white collar work could be just as monotonous, powerless, and stressful as factory work.
right.
Who thought it wasn't? I mean, was there a sense that it
I
wasn't?
think there was the popular belief. I mean, even when I was the idea that, well, if you had an office job, that was so much nicer and higher status than a factory job. And in many cases, it was. It was cleaner and much less physically arduous, but it had other problems. I think he also hit on the conformity issues, which later businesses realized themselves and realized we've got to make these workplaces more innovative and let people think out of the box, which of course led to the digital revolution in California.
When you were growing up, I think you mentioned your mother was a teacher.
Hmm.
What did your dad do?
My dad was a legal worker. He was not a lawyer, but he worked with lawyers and helped them, consultant.
Did you ever have one of those conversations about the importance of work?
Uh, I think it was just inbred that you worked. You worked. Um, you had to go to be good in school so you could get a good job. But I don't think we had, I can't remember a conversation about it.
Do you have any sense about what today's younger people think about work?
Complicated. Um, they are moving around so frequently, and I find that both fascinating and alarming. And I think the feeling is the whole compact between employees and employers has been broken over time. The feeling that employees no longer feel their employer is going to take care of them for life. So why should the employee stay? And it's really changed the workplace.
Book number 9, The Feminine Mystique,
Mhm.
Betty Friedan, 1963. What about Betty Friedan?
She uncovered something that set off an enormous change, which is, I mean, she wrote primarily about middle-class women who had gone to college and then became housewives, and that supported by their husbands, not working outside the home. They were taking care of children and they were taking care of the home. This was considered high status to be able to do this, and they were supposed to be very happy. And what she discovered is a lot of them were bored, frustrated. They didn't know what to do with themselves. Um, the book had enormous impact. It was widely read, and I think 30 million people. And it really set off a lot of the thinking that changed the workplace, because one of the major changes in the workplace in the late 20th century was the widespread movement of women into full-time, lifetime work and professional work. Ultimately, Betty Friedan started National Organization for Women and fighting for legislation for equal pay, equal rights. But it was definitely a book geared toward women who were equipped to do professional and managerial jobs and weren't allowed to.
The National Organization for Women, called NOW, has 555 chapters in 50 states,
Hmm.
still active to this day. I wonder, and this probably is something you didn't think about, but I was trying to contrast what Betty Friedan wrote about work with somebody that's on the other side, and that was Phyllis Schlafly. And
Yes,
she, at the same time, had a book that was as successful as Betty Friedan, A Choice, Not an Echo. Now, the difference on that,
yes.
she was a lawyer, and the book was primarily to boost Barry Goldwater, but she had the direct opposite views on femininity or the
Uh,
feminine.
exactly. She believed that women's domestic role was hugely important. Um, and women shouldn't be forced into the workplace if, unless they had to. Both books were geared toward the middle class, so
Have you written a book?
yes, I have.
What's it about?
I wrote a book a long time ago on women in American history.
What was your experience like?
My experience writing the book was a broader a broader form of what I felt writing this article on books about work, which was delving into American history and finding out things I didn't know. And at the
Were,
time I wrote the book, very little had been written about women in American history. Now, so much has been written, and there's so much more that's been discovered.
did you spotlight different people in your book?
I co-authored it with a very good friend of mine from college, and we certainly we split up topics. I ended up doing a lot about the workplace and work, and she did a lot about culture. Yeah, we ended up highlighting different women. If we were doing it today, we would probably highlight different women than we did then. Some of the same ones, but some different ones.
If you didn't graduate from Brandeis in literature and Columbia in journalism, and you had to make another choice for a profession, what would you have done?
Mm. Interesting question. I might have become a historian and gotten a PhD. That's one thing I might have done. I love history.
Would you have taught?
Yeah.
Number 10, last book on your list, Barbara Ehrenreich. She wrote this book in 2001,
Hmm.
Nickel and Dimed, on not getting by in America. At that time, there were 284 million people in the United States. Barbara Ehrenreich is deceased. We had her on C-SPAN on a number of occasions. Why did you choose that book?
I think she captured an issue in the workplace that was very important when she wrote it and is continuing to be important, which is that so many Americans are still having difficulty finding one job that will support them, that there's a huge group of people who have to do more than one job to survive. And that's what she focused in on nickel and dimed. And she also focused in on the service economy, which of course is still so important in the country and employs so many people, but often doesn't pay a living wage. Um, and she did it in a very unusual way. She did a first person journalistic account where she took jobs in different industries as a waitress and as a houseworker, housemaid in a hotel,
Now, you point out she took jobs in low wage sectors,
low wage service work.
waitress in Florida, maid in Maine, and finally as a retail associate at the Walmart store in Minnesota.
Right.
She was very big on unions. And
Yes, she was.
I looked up some figures this morning just to ask you about this. There are 163.99 million people who are employed in the United States today. And that figure, of course, can change. 14 million of them out of 163 million are union members. It's less than 10%.
Right.
In 1983, it was 20%.
Right.
The biggest union is the National Association of Education, National Education Association, with 3 million members. Another huge one at close to 2 million is the Service Employees International Union. And then the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, 1.5 million. The reason I bring this up is I wonder why more people today aren't members of a union in corporate America.
Well, the union movement never really reached white collar workers or service workers the way it did the industrial workers in the 1900s, and it still hasn't. And some people, there's a lot of debate in this area. Have unions helped people or hurt the economy, or where's the balance here? And it's an ongoing debate.
Those are the 10. I wanted to ask you about education because I heard on the radio this week a comment from Elon Musk. So I looked it up. This isn't the comment I heard, but it's similar. And I wanted your take on this. We're talking about college
Hmm.
because a lot more people are going to college today than were when Benjamin Franklin was around, as you know, on a percentage basis. It's
Hmm.
it's close to 42 to 43% today that enter college. There aren't that many that have a college degree. But anyway, here's what Musk says. Basically, college is for fun and to prove you can do your chores, emphasizing that skills and real world achievement matters more than degrees. He believes essential knowledge is accessible online, and that focusing on the problem solving and demonstrable ability leads to success, not just a diploma. And he's actually, I heard him say that college wasn't that important. What's your take on that?
I think college is important for ongoing learning. Maybe it could take place in a way other than college, and in fact, as we live longer, we're going to have to keep re-educating ourselves. We're not going to be able to stop going to school at the end of college or graduate school. We're going to probably have to go back and retool. And there's a whole movement of thought on that. Stanford is very involved in that. I think Musk is right in saying gaining practical knowledge is very important. You need both. One of the things college teaches you is how to think and learn about topics you wouldn't know about it broadens your mind, and you won't be able to work in everything that you study, but it's good to have a little bit of knowledge about it.
What does it mean that Bill Gates, Paul Allen, founders of Microsoft, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Abraham Lincoln, Oprah Winfrey, Frank Lloyd Wright, Michael Dell, dropped out of college?
Dropped out of college. Well, it really means that so much of learning is self-motivated. All of these people read enormously and taught themselves. So this is very different than not going to college and watching television or never learning anything. Very few people can do it all on their own. These people were all brilliant.
So, did you get any reaction out of your article?
I did. A lot of people wrote to me. They recommended other books. They had their thoughts. Why didn't I put this one or that one? And they all had good ideas. And this list needs to be expanded, and hopefully more people will keep adding to it. Got a lot of responses to the article.
Can you give us an example of a book that you read and you said, I thought this was going to be good, but it wasn't?
And it wasn't. Well, I'm having trouble thinking of that right now. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I will ask you this last question, though. Did you consider The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump?
I didn't. But it's a good idea. I didn't do that out of any political reason. I just didn't think of it as a book really about the workplace, although it is about the workplace and how to succeed. And I limited how-to books to the one book by Dale Carnegie.
If somebody wants to get your full article, is there a way, or do you have to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal?
I think you do have to subscribe. It's behind a paywall, unfortunately.
That was one of the early ones. Carol Hymowitz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.